very much for being with us today. I know it's a bit of an early morning, but we're running on a Friday schedule, so we appreciate your accommodation of coming in at 8:30. I would like to introduce, I'm just Francis Bradley with the Canadian Electricity Association, and he's the Chief Operating Officer. Thank you. I have Terry Toner, and you're going to tell me later if I'm getting the naming not quite right, because I'm notoriously bad at names, so my apologies. Director, Environmental Services, Nova Scotia Power. Thank you very much for being here. We have the Canadian Nuclear Association, and we have John Barrett, President and Chief Executive Officer. Thank you. And we have Liam Mooney at Vice President, Cameco Corporation. Thank you. And with the Mining Association of Canada, we have Pierre Graton, and he's the President and Chief Executive Officer. And we have Justina Laureline, Vice President, Environment and Regulatory Affairs. So I'm not sure which one of you would like to start off. Shall we start from your right to left? Please, you have the floor. Just so that you know how I work up here, I try not to interrupt people who are talking, but I do want to signal when you're coming to the end of your 10 minutes. I'll hold up the yellow card when you've got a minute to go. Red means that we're out of time. Please wrap up what you're trying to say in an expeditious way. Thank you. All right, the floor is yours.
Bon, je vous remercie, Madame la Présidente.
I'd like to thank you, Madam Chair, and members of the committee, for having invited the Canadian Electricity Association to appear before you for this important review of Bill C-69. And I'm pleased to represent the association as our CEO, Sergio Marchi, had a pre-scheduled commitment outside of Ottawa. Mr. Terry Toner, Director Environmental Services with Nova Scotia Power, is here with me today, however. Together, we will provide you with the electricity sector's perspective onto the bill, specifically the Impact Assessment Act. However, before I do so, I'd like to say a few words about the association. The CEA is the national voice and forum for the Canadian electricity sector. Our membership is comprised of major generation, transmission and distribution companies from across Canada, as well as manufacturers, technology companies and consulting firms representing the full spectrum of electricity suppliers. Electricity is indispensable to the quality of life of Canadians and to the competitiveness of our economy.
Is also uniquely positioned to contribute to a cleaner and greener energy era. For us to realize this opportunity, two conditions are critical. Our business environment must be competitive, and the regulatory framework must provide confidence that good projects will get built. As an industry, we are deeply preoccupied by the accumulation of wide-scoping federal and provincial and territorial legislative and regulatory changes. This pancaking, if you will, effect challenges the economics of needed investments in energy projects. Les ministres qui ont comparu devant ce comité.
The ministers who appeared before this committee last week spoke of their interest with Bill C-69 to ensure good projects get built. We applaud the intent. However, we believe that absent constructive amendments, Bill C-69 has the potential to discourage worthy investments. As a committee, you have an opportunity and an obligation to restore public trust and create a more predictable, balanced and workable piece of legislation. Let me turn to Terry Toner, who will share our specific recommendations.
By acknowledging that this bill contains a lot of progressive provisions. However, the following adjustments that we'll be talking about would further improve the intent of the Impact Assessment and Canadian Environmental Regulator Act. For the sake of brevity, I will be focusing my comments on the impact assessment portion. Speaking about clarity and predictability, Ministers McKenna and Carr spoke to the need for project proponents to know what is required of them from the beginning of the regulatory process. We would suggest some simple yet important modifications are necessary to meet this objective. Minister McKenna has made it clear that this Act is focused on major projects. We support this, and we look forward to that being reflected in the project list. The project list, to be developed by regulation, must firmly establish the scope of application of the Impact Assessment Act. The power of the Minister to designate other projects for review must be circumscribed and used only in exceptional circumstances based on criteria used to develop the list in the first place. The consideration of alternatives to a project should be limited to ones that are technically and economically feasible. Transitional provisions should also make clear that existing projects already on a regulatory path are not brought under the ambit of the Impact Assessment Act. In the quest for clarity and focus, we welcome strategic and regional assessments. It is our hope that these may ensure that individual project reviews are not burdened with analysis of impacts well beyond their scope. Too often now, project reviews are the place where we debate and litigate national policy in such domains as climate or Indigenous reconciliation. A project review should be just that, a project review. Speaking about timelines, while the timelines in the bill provide some guidance for project proponents, the government's goal of process predictability is significantly diluted by provisions in the Acts that permit limitless extensions and suspensions. Time is of critical value, and it can make the difference between a project built and a project abandoned. We accept that there must be some flexibility, but there must also be discipline and transparency in order to ensure investor confidence in Canadian infrastructure projects. Extensions decided by the Governor and Council should be published with reasons. There should be limits for the time taken by the Minister to establish the terms of reference and the composition of a panel. Once a decision is made at the end of the process, there should be a firm timeline to issue the decision and no capacity for the Governor and Council to delay. We also propose for your consideration a provision that could, quite importantly, give proponents and all participants some confidence that closure may be achieved at the end of an authoritative process, a privative clause that would narrowly contain the scope for legal challenges. There must be proper deference by all parties, including the courts, to the judgment exercised by authorities entrusted with the administration of this legislation. A project decision must not be the beginning of a new process played out in the courts. There are precedents for such clauses in other federal and provincial acts. Speaking about balance, it is critically important that the Impact Assessment Act ensures balanced consideration of environmental and economic factors. The current draft is deficient in that it can easily be recalibrated as per our following recommendations. The requirement to take into account whether the project hinders or contributes to the government's environmental obligations and commitments in respect of climate change is welcomed by our sector. We expect to make positive contributions to the Pan-Canadian Framework for Clean Growth and Climate Change. Yet there must be an explicit a requirement to take into account economic benefits, which currently is implied only by reference to a broad concept of sustainability. In speaking of cost recovery and proponents' obligation, any regulatory process must be subject to cost discipline. Costs charged to proponents should not exceed amounts reasonably incurred by the Crown. For predictability and good management, there should also be provided to the proponent at the beginning of the process an estimate of projected costs, in effect a budget. Our full submission to the committee next week will summarize the intent and wording of our proposed amendments. We commend them to your attention. Francis?
Merci, Terry. En conclusion,
Thank you, Terry. In closing, the real test of this legislation will be whether good, sustainable projects that are in the interest of Canadians move through the process and get built in a timely fashion.
the largest infrastructure projects are in the electricity sector. 4 hydro dams, 2 nuclear refurbishments, and a transmission line. Every one of these projects represents emissions-free energy for Canada. Transitioning to a clean energy future won't just happen. We must decide as a nation to build it. Les développeurs doivent avoir un processus fédéral prévisible.
Developers must have a predictable, credible federal process to work through. New and innovative technologies must not be stifled.
Clean energy future. How Bill C-69 is framed and implemented will go a long way to determining whether we achieve our national aspirations. Nous vous remercions de votre attention.
We'd like to thank you for your attention, and we'd be delighted to respond to any questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What we're going to do is we're going to hear from all the panelists, and then we'll go to questions. All right, so who's up next?
Thank you, Madam Chair. My name is John Barrett, and I'm President and CEO of the Canadian Nuclear Association. And with me today is Liam Mooney, Vice President, Safety, Health, Environment Quality, and Regulatory Relations with Cameco Corporation. The Canadian Nuclear Association has approximately 100 members representing over 60,000 Canadians employed directly or indirectly in uranium mining and exploration, fuel processing, electricity generation, and the production and advancement of nuclear medicine. Today, nuclear energy produces approximately 20% of Canada's non-emitting clean electricity, including 63% of Ontario's electricity. Of note, when the Ontario government committed to phasing out coal generation across the province, a major part of this commitment was made possible through the refurbishment of 6 reactors. Looking to the future, nuclear energy will play an increasingly important role in the overall low-carbon energy mix, as well as in nuclear medicine, advanced manufacturing, and electronics. Canada's nuclear industry also works closely with Indigenous peoples and communities, not only to enable proactive engagement, but also to create mutually beneficial opportunities. As one example, Cameco has worked closely with Indigenous communities in northern Saskatchewan for decades on environmental stewardship, community investment, employment, education and training, and contracting opportunities. Cameco has demonstrated the power of such partnerships in improving the economic and social well-being for communities and the benefits of working together to bring about real change. I would like to preface our feedback today by highlighting first the concept of cumulative impact, that it is not only a key issue with respect to the environment, but also with respect to investment in Canada. Large energy projects require large amounts of capital. Capital is fluid, and investors do not like uncertainty. So any new legislation, no matter how well-intentioned, creates initial uncertainty. Against this backdrop, CNA would like to offer the following comments and amendments for your consideration on Bill C-69. Let's start with joint panels. The draft bill proposes a single government agency be responsible for impact assessment reviews. In the case of the nuclear industry, the bill only provides for the option of an agency-led joint panel review. Now, while joint panels are not new, we've had them in the past, CNA does not believe this will be an improvement over the current process. Most of the potential impacts considered in relation to nuclear projects are related to radiation protection and international commitments on safeguards and non-proliferation. That work must be overseen by an agency with significant and specialized scientific expertise. The Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission, CNSC, is the only place in government with that expertise. The CNA believes that assessment should remain at the CNSC as the most efficient and effective way of conducting reviews. As a full life cycle regulator, the CNSC licensing regime and regulatory framework already covers the entire life cycle of the project and is subject to the Nuclear Safety and Control Act and its regulations. This allows CNSC, the Commission, to not only conduct the impact assessment in the planning phase of the project, but also to ensure that monitoring programs and follow-up conditions required by the impact assessment are directly integrated into the licensing process throughout the various stages of the projects. In this regard, our industry is unique, and the CNSC uniquely has the expertise to best manage our projects. I'll turn now to the designated project list. Bill C-69 makes provisions for a designated project list to be created by regulation. This list determines what projects are subject to review by the new agencies, and, by default, what projects will be reviewed by the life cycle regulator, as is in the case of the nuclear industry. It is difficult to fully consider the impact and consequences of the impact assessment agency without fully understanding what projects will come under the IAA review. The CNA believes a facility or project should undergo one impact assessment for its life cycle. As drafted, Section 43 could be interpreted as to require an impact assessment for any activity at a facility regulated under the Nuclear Safety and Control Act. However, maintenance, technological, and capital upgrades are fully regulated by the life cycle regulator, by provincial regulators, or by other federal authorities, and thus there is no need for a new IA. So this could be clarified. In addition, many of our sites are large and with significant space for new facilities, including new reactors and research facilities that could require an IA under the new agency. Most nuclear sites have undergone full environmental assessments. They have had continuous environmental monitoring, and their environmental impact is well understood. If a new project were to occur on one of these existing sites, it should not require a full impact assessment, but rather an assessment of the delta between what has already been done and what is now required. In our view, the delta assessment could be best done by the life cycle regulator. On timelines, CNA members have significant concerns over the proposed timelines. We understand and we appreciate the government's intention with an early planning phase, but are somewhat skeptical of the potential effectiveness. As the early planning phase occurs after the proponent has provided an initial project description, the proponent will have already undertaken stakeholder engagement to ensure the business case and to have some degree of confidence that the issues can be mitigated. The CNA believes the current process already allows for the important early input and engagement from local communities, Indigenous groups, and public stakeholders. In addition to the uncertainty caused by creating a new agency-run early engagement process, Bill C-69 dramatically increases the scope of assessment by adding several new elements of review. While the criteria, aims, and goals of environmental assessment are well understood and measurable, there is a great deal of uncertainty around some of the new elements of assessment. We would like to work with the government to provide greater definition on how the various elements are weighted in decision-making. Are all elements weighted equally? Is there a minimum weighting level that must be met? Answers to such questions will help proponents factor in these elements in their project description and in their early engagement with stakeholders. Our members have concerns too about how closure will be achieved with respect to issues raised through the review process. It is our view that without some decision-making procedure that allows closure on contentious issues, the new IA process will simply add uncertainty and increase timelines, create additional work having minimal benefits for the project, and result in multiple legal challenges. I will now hand over to Liam Mooney to head to our recommendations.
Thank you, John. One of the specific amendments that the CNA would like to propose is to the multiple scoping phases in the proposed process. The planning phase was intended in part to improve certainty and predictability by determining the requirements the proponent would have to meet early in the process. In our view, the bill's process does not achieve that goal. The proposed bill sets out an initial scoping by the agency as informed by federal authorities, all other jurisdictions, the public, and Indigenous groups. However, the bill also allows for 2 additional scoping phases, one at the sole discretion of the agency and one by the review panel, which is appointed later. These final 2 potential scoping phases are well into the process. It could change the scope of the project after the proponent has spent years and millions of dollars to comply with the original scoping decision. For panel reviews, a one project, one review process can only occur if the scoping stage is coordinated amongst the agency, the review panel, and all federal regulators, as well as harmonized with provincial or other jurisdictional requirements. For this to occur, 2 overarching amendments must be made. First, the chronology of the provisions in the proposed bill must be changed, and successive scoping stages throughout the assessment process must be replaced by a consolidated single, harmonized scoping early in the process that is led by the review panel. The CNA would also like to propose an amendment with respect to uranium mining. Similar amendments have been proposed by the Mining Association of Canada and the Prospector and Developers Association of Canada. More specifically, designated projects that are related to uranium mines and mills, like any other designated mining project, should undergo agency assessments with full access to provisions with cooperation with provinces and Indigenous governing bodies. Uranium mines and mills, like all other mines and mills, are subject to provincial regulatory and permitting frameworks, but they are also regulated by the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission. Federal environmental assessment legislation has historically allowed the CNSC to cooperate with the province in the ongoing oversight of uranium mines and mills. However, Bill C-69 would preclude this cooperation and prevent agency-led assessments, joint review panel assessments, and substitution for all designated projects that are regulated by the CNSC. As a result, the opportunity for cooperation with the province and using a one process, one assessment approach is lost by treating all such projects as exclusively in federal jurisdiction. There's no justification for such a different treatment because the complexity and impacts of uranium mines and mills are not in a different category from those of other mines and mills. Cooperative assessment processes across jurisdictions increase efficiency and decrease timelines and costs and should be available to uranium mines and mills. The CNSC, like other federal regulatory bodies, would have the opportunity to be engaged in an agency-led assessment as provided for in the proposed process to encourage coordination within the federal government. The CNA urges the committee to recommend changes to the provisions dealing with CNSC-regulated projects to permit designated projects related to uranium mines and mills to access the agency assessment provisions of the bill, including the suite of provisions related to cooperation with provinces and Indigenous governance bodies. Further, we would propose that mines and mills be specifically excluded from the automatic panel review created by Section 43 by adding other than a uranium mine or mill after each reference to the Nuclear Safety and Control Act.
Is that the end? Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. And we have one more. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, members of the committee. It's a pleasure for the Mining Association of Canada to be with you today. Membres du comité, members of the committee, I'm mad. Je suis contrarié. Last week you heard from Minister
Mad.
who said, and I quote, all projects that are currently under review will be reviewed under the NEB. Even after the legislation is proclaimed, these projects that began under the current system will remain under the current system unless the proponent makes the choice to move to the new one, and it would be a decision that the proponent would make. Makes sense. Such logic befits a democratic country such as ours where rule of law is respected. But what he didn't tell you is that for mining projects and all others subject to agency assessment, the rule of law will be ignored by this bill. In the case of mining, only projects at the very end of their review awaiting final decision will remain under SIA 2012. All other projects that are any earlier in the process will transfer to the new IA Act and essentially start again in some way, shape or form to be determined by officials on a case-by-case basis, however they think best, at a date we don't yet know. When we asked why this is, we were told that the government is concerned that there would be projects a few years after the Act came into force that would still be governed by SIA 2012, and that these assessments would lack public confidence. They said they wanted to clean house, bring all assessments forward under one Act to make their workload a little less complicated. The fact that it will make the workload of mining companies wanting to invest billions of dollars in Canada a whole lot more complicated didn't seem to matter. Je vous demande, pourquoi le gouvernement prévoit-il?
I asked the committee, why is it that the government feels that there will be a lack of public confidence for mining reviews, but not for pipelines? Why the double standard in Bill C-69? Shouldn't the government be more concerned about the lack of international investor confidence in Canada's respect for the rule of law?
It is not fear or opposition to the IA Act itself that makes me say this. As will be evident in a minute, we believe that the proposed legislation, implemented well, may actually result in an improved review process for mining than SIA 2012. The problem is the uncertainty. Proponents making billion-dollar investments need to know what the rules are and how they will be implemented, and you can't have this certainty knowing that the rules may change in some way midstream. MACTA strongly recommends that the committee support the proposed amendment in our submission that would change the transition provisions by amending Section 181 so that projects undergoing SIA 2012 agency assessment will continue under SIA 2012, but allow the proponent to request transition of the assessment to the IAA, i.e. the same as for NEB projects. Now let me turn to comments on the rest of the proposed legislation. There are a number of measures that, implemented well, as I said, hold the promise of an improved review process for mines. Mining is constitutionally the responsibility of provinces, and each of Canada's provinces has their own environmental assessment regimes. In addition to the requirements for building and operating a mine, provinces require companies to develop reclamation plans and provide financial assurance for their implementation. Cooperation with other jurisdictions on project review is therefore critical for the mining sector. Although SIA 2012 introduced for the first time the possibility of substitution to other jurisdictions, in practice this has only been taken up by one province, namely British Columbia. SIA 2012 also introduced legislative timelines, which are critical for industry and the smooth functioning of assessment. However, SIA 2012's timelines are rigid and have had the unintended effect of making cooperation with other jurisdictions that have not pursued substitution more difficult and at times unworkable. The proposed IAA maintains timelines but provides for flexibility to better align with other jurisdictions, plus contains a number of other measures that should improve cooperation with provincial governments. As well, we are encouraged that the new proposed legislation provides for extending cooperation with Indigenous governments. There is one notable exception, and that is the one that my colleague and friend next to me, Liam Mooney, just mentioned with respect to uranium mines and mills. I won't repeat what he has just said. I think he made the exact same point that I was going to make, except to emphasize that while, as I've just said, there are measures in this proposed legislation that actually promise to improve coordination for mining projects with other levels of government, it takes a step backward when it comes to uranium mines and mills. And that needs to be addressed in the way that Liam Mooney just outlined. So we really urge this committee to take that recommendation extremely seriously. It's our understanding as well that this is actually a measure that was inadvertent, and so I'm hopeful that this committee will recognize that as such and correct it. Beyond provincial assessment and permitting and federal assessment, many mines require other federal approvals. Inadequate interdepartmental coordination has been a source of duplication and delays for mining for years. MAC therefore is encouraged by subsection 13.2 and related provisions which hold the promise of improved coordination and shorter timelines, though I might add that the different treatment for NEB projects and SIA suggests that there is still work to do to improve coordination between two parts of government. Perhaps our greatest concern with SIA 2012 has been how it has disproportionately applied the responsibility for cumulative effects to proposed mining projects and not to the sources of most environmental effects. The project-by-project approach to addressing cumulative effects in SIA 2012 is dysfunctional, penalizing responsible project proponents while failing to address cumulative effects resulting from activities that are not designated projects under the Act. The mining industry is not the only user of the land base. Its impacts are localized and, on most metrics of environmental effects, dwarfed by other activities. We're encouraged, therefore, by the approach proposed in the IAA, which includes cumulative effects as a factor to consider, but not as a sole factor in decision-making. The IAA also proposes to strengthen provisions for regional and strategic assessments. Les gouvernements sont les mieux placés pour...
Governments are best practiced, or best placed rather, to undertake cumulative effects assessment on a regular basis. We've been advocating for these measures for over 15 years, and so we're pleased to see them incorporated in the IAA. It is critical, however, that the completion of regional assessments not be a prerequisite to individual project assessments. It would be unreasonable and prohibitive to Canada's investment climate to delay projects while awaiting governments to address all relevant gaps.
Regional studies across the country, and we can't wait for all of those to be completed before we allow projects to move forward. Related to these issues is the project list, where mining makes up the vast majority of SIA projects, despite a relatively small footprint. While the revision of the regulations designating physical activities is subject to separate consultations, we are concerned that the IAA will remain arbitrarily and disproportionately applied to mining. Should this be the case, it will hamper our sector while not achieving the sustainability, public trust, and Indigenous reconciliation goals the Act is purported to advance. Let me conclude with the following message. Our sector has entered a new period of strong commodity prices, and decisions are being made around the world on where to invest. Unfortunately, pipeline politics and the general politicization of natural resources development in a country that is a recognized leader in natural resources is putting our country's future at risk. La part relative de l'investissement.
Canada's relative share of global mineral exploration investment has fallen by half in the past 5 years, and the number of projects submitted for review has hit record lows since the original CEAA was proclaimed in 1992. Sadly, most of my members are not choosing Canada right now, and I fear that unless the situation I described improves quickly, Canada is going to largely miss the current cycle, accelerating this decline. This will impact a sector with nearly 400 agreements with Indigenous communities across Canada that has become the largest employer of Indigenous peoples across Canada and one of the largest clients of Indigenous businesses.
Stability and predictability in the regulatory environment governing natural resources. It is in this spirit that we submit our comments on this proposed legislation. The proposed legislation, while not perfect, addresses some long-standing concerns we have had with federal environmental assessment and some more recent problems we've experienced with SIA 2012. If implemented well, and this is a critical if, and if you support our two critical amendments, the proposed legislation could bring some certainty and predictability back to federal project review of mining projects. Thank you.
Thank you all very much for your introductions, and you've given us a lot to think about, so we'll get into that with questions. So the first up is Mr. Basio.
Thank you all for being here this morning. We really appreciate your presence and the information that you've shared with us this morning and some of your concerns. My first interaction will be with the Canadian Electricity Association. Under Ontario's EA Act, and I've had some experience with the EA Act in Ontario, there's a regulation, Ontario Reg 116/01, that sets out an environmental screening process for certain public-private electricity projects, particularly large and controversial projects that can be bumped up to an individual EA if appropriate. What has been the experience under this regulatory impact assessment process? And are electricity projects getting built? And is this a good example of using different EA tracks for different size projects within the same sector?
The member that I have with me today is not from Ontario, so would not be able to speak to the Ontario specific experience. But Terry can certainly talk to his experience within his jurisdiction.
Well, there certainly are provisions in multiple provinces for different levels of review. Nova Scotia, where I am, there are 2 levels, and that works well. I think what we're looking at here, though, is the process described in the bill is a fairly extensive process. There's a lot of time. There's a significant amount, inappropriately so, for public and Indigenous participation and for panel review. And so I think that when we look at projects that might be affecting federal jurisdiction, there are other mechanisms that we would say that can provide relief. One example simply being the Fisheries Act, which is also undergoing changes right now and has authorizations, and now they've added a designated project provision with the ability to issue permits. So I think the intention of having different levels of review is appropriate.
Actually, that's all right. Sorry, I have a limited time, and I wanted to try to focus that so that I could glean some particular information. And maybe what you could do is have the Ontario side of your organization to respond to that particular question, if you could, please.
Yep.
And just to follow on what you were just saying about meaningful participation by public and Indigenous communities in the information gathering, decision making, and follow-up process stages of the IAA process, I assume that you support having meaningful participation by these different interests.
Absolutely.
Yeah, we certainly do, and we see the new early planning element that has been added to the process as a very positive one. It involves, and it will build upon, let's be honest, what companies like ours already do, even before we get to that stage. So we're very encouraging of that.
Okay, thank you. I assume the other two groups feel the same way about having meaningful public participation, Indigenous participation?
Absolutely. In fact, I might add that for SIA projects under SIA 2012, at no point were any interested parties disqualified from project reviews. The criticism that has been made over the last number of years has largely directed towards the NEB, but just for your information, that's never actually happened with mining projects. Anyone who's wanted to participate has been able to.
Thanks, and I would only add in that regard that good proponents have been carrying out the best practices in that early engagement for a good long period of time. It helps with project design and ultimately securing the support of the local stakeholders as well as the regulatory officials in that regard.
Now, my experience in the EA process, and like I said, I've been involved in them for 20 years, and now it has been limited to the province of Ontario, admittedly. But one of the chief concerns that I've had throughout all of those processes has been the inability or the lack of the ability of those different public stakeholders or Indigenous stakeholders to participate because of lack of funding. Do you agree that there should be participant funding in the amounts that are commensurate with the scale, the impacts of the proposed projects? Sure, if any of you would like to.
Yes, I think we do, and I think that actually is there's a real opportunity in the early planning. One of the outcomes is a public participation plan, and that should outline what is necessary, and the government will hear from Indigenous and from stakeholders and hopefully be able to identify the appropriate amount of funding.
Mining Association, environmental groups, and Indigenous organizations lobbied finance together to try to persuade them to ensure there was sufficient funding to support this legislation in terms of participation. So I think that answers your question.
On the on the Canadian.
Okay, sorry, I hate to cut you off, but I wanted to add one more quick thing, and that is, it seems like you're supporting intervenor funding, but actually, I'm thinking that rather than it coming from the public purse, that it actually should be coming from polluter pay principle. That the companies should be the ones that should be putting forward funding that would be commensurate with the scale and scope of the project.
I think you need to recognize first that companies, mining proponents, for certain, are engaging on an ongoing basis with communities and do provide that kind of capacity support as projects develop. It's part of how we do business. What this is about, and I think this is important, this is the government's own regulatory process, and I think it's completely appropriate for the government to also provide participant funding. And I think if the government didn't, it would face significant public criticism. I think communities and Indigenous groups expect some of that funding to come from government. It would otherwise, I don't think they feel that there would be full confidence in it.
Thank you very much. Appreciate that.
All right, next up, Mr. Fast.
Well, thank you very much for appearing before us. My first question is to Mr. Barrett. When you ask Canadians what they understand when they hear the word nuclear, typically they think either nuclear weapons, which Canada doesn't have, or they think nuclear-generated electricity, which Canada does have, like the Darlington plant in Ontario. But isn't it true that Canada's footprint when it comes to the nuclear industry, including uranium mining, extends far beyond Canada and has positive impacts on the global carbon footprint?
Oops, sorry. Thank you very much for the question. Yeah, one of the most important things for our industry to do is to, first of all, as you have done, point out the difference between the use of nuclear technology on the weapons side, which is completely separate. We're governed by the International Non-Proliferation Treaty. Canada is a civil peaceful uses of nuclear technology country, full stop. Internationally, we have a lot of expertise. I know that as former Canadian ambassador to the International Atomic Energy in Vienna and chair of the Board of Governors there, that there's always been quite considerable respect for Canada because of its knowledge. Its regulatory expertise is international. I mean, we almost set a gold standard in that regard. And that's something that is people are not fully aware of, I think, and normal everyday Canadians don't see that type of expertise that is recognized internationally. And the other point I would make, that I think you were alluding to, is that when you consider the uranium mining and the products of that go into fuel development and the source of fuel for reactors that may be in other countries and may be under different types of technology, not CANDU reactors, but that fuel goes there, then that is contributing to emissions-free electricity. And so there is a direct connection between what is mined in Canada by the uranium mining and shipped internationally. We are contributing to reducing that, especially if the alternative would have been for a country to turn to coal or one of the fossil fuels and say that's what we would use, but here we have nuclear. I give the example of Romania that does have a CANDU reactor. If you look at their geographical situation, I'm sure their alternative would have been a fossil fuel. But they have 2 Canadian reactors. So it's our reactor technology and the fuel that we provide. We've looked at the numbers there to calculate what that has been over the last 2-3 decades. It's a real contribution to climate.
Now, does Canada actually get credit for those emissions reductions that are generated by the use of Canada's uranium elsewhere around the world, or our technology around the world?
I've never seen it calculated quite like that, and indeed we were pointing out to Natural Resources Canada a couple of years ago this phenomenon, and they began to look at it for the first time as far as I understand. So no, it isn't really recognized, but it's an important facet of when you're looking at our industry and its contribution on the climate change file. Yeah. It's significant, and as I mentioned in my remarks, 20% of Canada's clean electricity today comes from nuclear power.
Yeah. Thank you. That's very helpful. I have a question for Mr. Gratton. I think all of us took note of your remarks right at the beginning of your comments about Minister Carr's statement. And just for the record, I'm going to read the quote of the minister back into the record. He said, and this was at the meeting that he appeared before us to address this very bill last week. He said, and I quote, "All projects that are currently under review will be reviewed under the National Energy Board. We are expecting this legislation will be ratified by Parliament sometime in 2019. So it will be as is until the legislation is proclaimed." So he clearly made a commitment that all projects that are in the pipeline under 2012 SIA would continue to be under that regime until that process had been completed. There would be no starting at the beginning under the new provisions. That concerns me that the legislation right now, as worded, does not reflect what the minister has said. So he's either mischaracterized the legislation or he's somehow misstated the facts. But I think all of us at this table have taken note of this. And what I would ask you to do is the amendments that you're looking for to remedy that failing in this legislation, if you would provide us with some draft wording and circulate that amongst all the members of this committee so we have that, so we can make sure that this act actually does what the minister promised it would do.
Not to defend the minister, what the minister said was technically true for NEB, and he was speaking about NEB projects. And this is an issue of sort of one side of government wasn't talking or coordinating very well with the other side of government. You have the agency and you have the NEB. So he's responsible for the NEB, and what he said is true about the NEB. The rules are different for mining that fall under the agency. We don't fall under the NEB. That's the problem. In our brief, you will have actually specific language on how this can be amended, which I think has been submitted. Yes, it's been submitted. if I could take a second too, just to also point out on in relation to your previous question, the copper and coal that we export from BC is also some of the lowest carbon generated copper and coal to use for electrification around the world and for steel making. Just thought I'd point that out.
And we don't get credit
Thank
for
you
that
very
either,
much.
do we?
That's great. Next up is Ms. Duncan.
This is not going to work. Can they turn this one on instead? Maybe you can. Are the interpreters hearing on this mic? Okay, thank you. To the Canadian Electricity Association, I'm puzzled at your discussion about federal assessments. In the 50 years of building coal-fired power plants and gas plants, I don't think there has ever been either an individual federal assessment panel or even a joint panel. So am I hearing you in saying that you're open to that and that would be a good idea and that perhaps should be on the project list?
You're talking about a coal-fired plant?
No major facility to generate electricity in Alberta, and I believe, has ever been subject to a federal panel. So do I understand that you're suggesting that there should be federal panels?
I think what we've said and would say is that we're not confident that new coal will be built, new coal-fired generation, so that takes care of that for you. Secondly, natural gas, we think we really need to understand what level and size would be appropriate to be on the project list, and that is under consideration under the discussion paper that is out now looking at that. But obviously, if we have a clean site that has already existed and there's some expansion, and that is helping coal shut down, and this is an appropriate transitional and necessary generation, I think that has to be evaluated against criteria to see whether it meets those criteria to be on the list.
Okay, thank you. I have some concern with these suggestions, which two of the interveners have suggested, that when there are expansions on site, there's no need for hearing, and I object to that because there's additional carbon emissions and additional pollution, and in those sectors, they are very serious emissions and impacts. I heard from both the Canadian Nuclear Association, Canadian Electricity Association, and I'm not sure that mining mentioned it, but you might want to respond. I didn't get a chance to ask the oil industry this, but I asked them after, and they shared the concern of a lot of people that this bill is being processed before we even see the project list. Do you agree with what some people are saying is there should be an opportunity to see this project list before this legislation is finalized so we see that what it applies to?
I'll take a stab at answering, if I may. On the latter point, yes, we do agree and have suggested in our intervention that the concurrent, having the project list at the same time as considering the Act would help immensely, because there are some calculations and considerations that would just, I think, be very practical, and I think that could be done. On the question of the activities, different activities on a licensed site, I think what we were suggesting is not that that new sort of capital expenditures that occur on the licensed site would be completely free of any assessment. It's just that the site has the environmental assessment as a sort of baseline.
Well, the site is the facility, right? The site means the land to me. You mean the facility.
Well, if you have the facility and you're adding something to it, you could consider that as a delta, like rather than doing a complete review from start to finish, you would sort of look at then the delta.
I understand that. That's not a new argument from industry. That is a continuous argument by all sectors. I would like to ask the Canadian Electricity Association, you talked about sustainability of your facility. Can you tell us what your interpretation is of what sustainability means under this bill?
I'll take that. Well, actually, there's lots of debate still taking place as to exactly what it does mean in general in many locations, including the Multi-Interest Advisory Committee that I sit on. It's being developed, but we know that it expands to be more than just environment, that sustainability will take into account, as it says in the bill, aspects of socioeconomic health and I believe also cultural and indigenous. the way in which that is going to be assessed, I think this is an evolving area, and I think we're trying to deliver in our sector more sustainable projects. We're moving from projects that people have a lot less satisfaction with to ones that are more fit for the future we move forward.
And I would just add to that, to Terry's point. Fundamentally, what is it that we're attempting to deliver and what we're attempting to drive towards? As a country, we have made very significant commitments to greenhouse gas emission reductions in the 2030 and also in the 2050 timeframe. In that context, there is absolutely no way we're going to even get anywhere near any of those targets without a very significant expansion of the clean electricity sector. We're going to have to move pretty aggressively into electrifying transportation and other parts of the economy, and the only way we're going to be able to do that is if we are able to in fact expand the clean energy sector in this country.
Thanks. Mining Association raised this issue, and I think others might have, but it left me puzzled because in my involvement with projects, you are applying for your federal and provincial permits at the same time you're going through the environmental assessment, your water permits, your air permits. So I don't understand why you would say that if you're on the regulatory path already, then there shouldn't be a new assessment. Can you clarify, if you've already applied for your permits, but you haven't gone through an assessment process yet, you're not saying you shouldn't have to go through the new assessment process? It was because you said some projects are already on the regulatory path. Okay, and most people apply for the regulations at the same time they're going through the EIA. So all you're saying is that if you haven't gone through the SIA, okay, we'll do the new process.
No, so what we're saying is we have, one of our members right now is wondering whether or not they actually should submit their project for federal environmental assessment under the current act or not. And they've got advisors saying they shouldn't. They should wait until the new act comes in because they don't know what the rules are going to be. Halfway through, they're going to change. And that's, you can't make investment decisions not knowing how a new act is going to function, which is something that was recognized fully for NEB projects.
So sorry to do this. I let Linda go on a bit longer because I wanted to hear the answer, but I can't let it go on too much longer. So thank you. Mr. Fisher.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair. Thank you, folks, for being here. Very good testimony, and I truly appreciate the very pointed recommendations that you're all making. First question is going to go to the Canadian Electricity Association. So, Francis or Terry, Bill C-69 has shortened timelines for decision-making, both for project reviews and for Cabinet. With the new early planning phase, which will include outreach with stakeholders, Indigenous communities, and others, do you think that the timeframes are going to be reasonable to get all this done? I'm looking at Terry only because I know him, but Francis, perhaps you.
I know Terry's been.
Well, I think if the process, and we don't know yet, we haven't seen it happen, but 180 days is 6 months. We'll have done, as most proponents would have done, a lot of work before we even get to trigger that. If the government is ready, the agency and so on, and I think they will be, and people are collaborative, I think that we can do it, and I think the government can do it. If there are requests for delays of the process at the various stages of the process, I think that's where we're concerned about the risk. But if it's an open and collaborative process with real opportunity for all of the stakeholders and the Indigenous communities to participate, I'm confident that we can get projects through.
Do you, other than what you just stated, do you have any other suggestions you want to get on the record here for things that it might improve the process?
One of the things that, there's already a pretty good list of products that come out of that, and one of the things that is often done in provincial processes is provisional orders, which provides more specificity, collaborative agreements and other things, to make sure that not only do we know what the plan is, we know the timeframes that are going to be associated, the mechanisms with which people are going to participate, hopefully they're the appropriate amount, and that provides a degree of certainty and planning for all of the people in the process.
Great, thank you. I'm going to move to John or Liam from the Nuclear Association. I hope you're okay if I call you John and Liam. The definition of adverse effects is broader, and it'll now read changes to environment or to health, social or economic conditions, and the consequences of these changes. How will this potential change impact your industry?
Sure. In that regard, I think that's some of the uncertainty that's been mapped out by our colleagues at the CEA and through the Mining Association. I think that we have a lot of experience on environmental assessment and the impacts and assessment of those. Some of these other factors are more in the space of social sciences, and to make determinations and decisions based on that broader definition will be a challenge. And I think that's something that we've said in our own remarks that we'd like to seek some additional clarification with respect to. Terry referred to the Multi-Industry Advisory Committee. I'm the CNA representative on that committee, and I can say in that regard there has been some concern expressed by the industry representatives at that table about the weighing of the different factors that are included in that determination. I think one of the more prominent issues that we want to bring to the table is that the focus on adverse effects is sort of the language of it starts in a negative space when you have to also take into account the socioeconomic benefits of the development in question.
Okay, I do have another question. I see mining would like to chime in. If you're able to do that in 15 or 20 seconds so I can get one more question, that would be.
Yeah, I just wanted to point out that for mining projects, because of our heavy engagement with Indigenous communities, because of where our projects are, some of those sort of new aspects of this proposed legislation are already factored into to a degree.
Yeah.
And so it's not we don't feel it's a huge shift for us. But I would agree that it needs to be, time will tell just how it all plays out.
Fair enough. Again, for John or Liam, Indigenous traditional knowledge is going to be taken into consideration when assessing a project. Can you tell us a little bit about the ways that you currently consider Indigenous knowledge when you or your members are working on a proposed project? And if you finish in time, any remaining time, I wouldn't mind mining chiming in on that at the last second as well.
Sure. In that regard, I think we've had a long history of engaging with our local stakeholders and understanding their concerns. I think that incorporation of that Indigenous knowledge and the feedback from those communities is a big part of the shaping of the specific projects in question and designing them to address and mitigate potential impacts in that regard. I think the other piece that I would be remiss if I didn't speak to was on the provincial side of the assessment. Mr. Gratton referred to our experience in that regard, that in provincial assessments in Saskatchewan at least, they are broader in their context. So the adverse effects and the broader take in that regard is something that we've had quite a bit of experience with and enjoyed a considerable success with.
Do you want to run out the clock, Pierre, for that?
Yeah, well, that's also true for other jurisdictions like BC and Quebec. So we're not breaking new ground in the mining sector all that much with those aspects. And I mean, I think we speak to it in our brief, and we've spoken to it in the past in terms of traditional knowledge. One of the challenges is at times communities it's proprietary, and so it can be challenging to get them to share that knowledge, particularly publicly. If they're sharing knowledge about where their trap lines are, they're disclosing to others where they hunt, and that's an issue. So it is a delicate issue, but it's one that we have some experience working with, and we're comfortable with moving forward with it.
Thank you so much. Appreciate that. Monsieur Godin.
Merci, Madame la Présidente.
Thank you very much, Madam Chair, and I'd call on attendees to put their headsets on. I'd like to thank the witnesses who used the language of Molière to speak, because we are in a bilingual country. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for being here today. I have a very straightforward question at the outset. I would like to know what the legislation that we are currently reviewing will enable your sector to do in terms of improving or reducing the impact of greenhouse gas emissions.
Well, perhaps I can begin. Everything that we're going to have to do in the future to be able to build out the clean energy future of this country is going to require the sorts of reviews that are envisaged in this legislation. There's no way we're going to be able to meet our clean energy future with the system that we currently have today. So it's inevitable that there's going to be a requirement for a significant build-out. So much so, for example, the study by the Trotte Energy Futures, which attempted to assess what would our greenhouse gas emissions commitments out to 2050 look like, and their expectation is that it would result in a doubling or tripling of the requirement for electricity in this country. So to even be able to take a step into that future is going to require an efficient and open regulatory regime.
Thank you. If I may also add from our perspective, and I think it's an excellent question because we try to frame as best as possible the work of our industry within that larger context, because that is really the key element of the industry. It can contribute all of this very dense source of clean electricity to our country and to others around the world. So when we look at the Act and we see this is the opportunity to allow projects to proceed on a timely basis with producing the confidence among all stakeholders, among communities and citizens, that this is very safe, that is being environmentally, the protection is there, and people are satisfied with that. Because what is coming down the track internationally and certainly in Canada, we're being seen right now as a leader in the development of advanced nuclear technology that may be reduced in size so that you have smaller types of reactors that could have applications that open up a vast array of possibilities in Canada and elsewhere, where you're not looking at huge capital projects that could break the bank. You're looking at smaller reactors, right down to a kind of a battery. They go in small communities. So my point, I'll stop here, but the main point is that working hand in glove, industry and with the Act, we could really do some very impressive things for our country.
Merci.
Oui, premièrement, j'aimerais souligner.
Thank you. To begin with, I'd like to emphasize that our contribution is rather minor. Secondly, there are two projects currently in Ontario regarding the rolling out of electric vehicles for mining projects underground, and that's part of our ongoing efforts to reduce GHG emissions. Third, I should emphasize that our products are essential for the economy of the future, whether it be copper or lithium. These are essential products for the economy of the future. Fourth, one way of ensuring that there is GHG emission reductions is by investing in infrastructure. Now, if we look at our projects in northern Canada, there is full reliance on diesel. They have no other choice. Now, were we able to invest in hydroelectric projects and perhaps were that to come to fruition, small nuclear reactors, that would help to reach other solutions. Question. Well, it's my understanding that you've already taken steps to improve or to reduce the impact on the environment, that sustainable development is important, and to reduce GHG emissions. And I think everyone around the table shares your desire, your passion, if you will, to have the smallest environmental footprint on the planet. The Environment Commissioner this past week tabled a report stating that we haven't made any progress in terms of meeting our GHG emissions by 2020 and by 2030. Now, it would be my submission that this government is introducing this legislation, but its report card for the past number of years is not really overwhelmingly favourable. Do you think we're on the right track? Do you think that this proposed legislation will help you to make headway? You know, there's overtime, there's an additional paperwork burden, a lack of clarity, what powers the minister will have. How do you see your industry as a result of all of that?
So long to ask it. So quick answer, very quick.
Yes, if I may go first. I think that the recommendations that we're trying to put forward on the table, but I'm hearing from the other organizations that are mainly driven by making this an effective vehicle for getting the environmental considerations well under control and to everyone's satisfaction, but making it work for the industry. If we get that right, I think then we can start really moving into addressing the electrification needs to get to a clean and low carbon economy for Canada.
Thank you very much. That's all we've got time for. They may get another question, and they will get another question. They can pick that up at that time. Okay, Mr. Maloney.
Thank you, Madam Chair. I'm splitting my time, so I've got to get right to the point here. Mr. Toner, my question is to you. You raised this idea of a privative clause, which is very interesting. Could you explain to us where you're going with that? So how comprehensive do you mean this to be? Do you mean it covers all decisions, certain decisions? What would that look like, and do you have specific recommendations on what it would look like?
We will have specific in our final report. I think really what we're talking about here is the notion of saying that this is a fairly extensive process that will allow for a good debate and participation of all sectors. And the thought should be that, yes, there are some things that still would be court challengeable, but there would be other things that perhaps as we get to a decision, that should be the decision. It should be a higher bar before court challenge is possible.
Okay, so you're going to provide us with your recommendations language on what that would look like? Okay. What areas specifically, can you tell us right now, would you include or exclude?
I think we're mostly interested in the final decision that comes at the end of the process.
So that would be unchallengeable by the courts then? Or in the courts?
Relatively unchallengeable. I think we can never say completely unchallengeable. I think there are always occasions that in this country that things could be raised, but there would have to be reasons, and I think the courts would have to recognize that the process has been good and that the legislation would attempt to ensure that that process has led to a balanced decision that has had proper discussion.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Gratton, my next question is for you. You talked about the transitional provisions and the difference between the mining and the pipeline provisions. And thank you for clarifying what Mr. Fass said. I know he didn't intentionally mean to take out of context what the minister had said. If the transitional provisions were made to be the same, would that satisfy your concern, and would that change your answer with respect to investor confidence?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, exactly as it is for NEB, with the option to opt in. It may be that there's a proponent entering very late before this act comes into force that may say, you know what, we'll plan for the next one. There are certain elements of this act that may actually prove to be more attractive. We don't know about, the early planning is an innovation. It has potential. It may be that a proponent may actually choose to opt in to take advantage of the early planning idea that's in this act. So we're asking that, but we ask that option, just as it is for NEB projects, be left to the discretion of the proponent between now and the act coming into force.
Thank you very much, Chair.
Split. Mr. Rogers?
Thank you, Madam Chair. This question is for the Electrical Association, Terry or Francis. Generally speaking, I guess your statement of February 8th was pretty positive in terms of the legislation. I think it's fair to say. But there was one concern that you identified in regards to navigable waters. You expressed concerns over potential increased delays because of permitting. The early planning phase in the bill is intended to support one project, one assessment. And my understanding is that at the end of this early planning phase, if the impact assessment is required, 3 documents would be issued to guide the impact assessment process, including an impact assessment cooperation plan, which including Indigenous engagement and partnership plan and public participation plan, a tailored impact statement guidelines, and a permitting plan if required. And these would provide clear and transparent expectations for project proponents and the public. So can you comment on how this may alleviate your concerns?
Well, maybe Terry, if you want to talk to some of the specifics, and of course we're dealing with this piece of legislation on a separate track. But I mean, our overall fundamental concern was that there is already existing legislation and regulation for the protection of water. It seems as though these changes are starting to creep into that area. And again, going back to the comments I made at the very beginning, add additional layers of pancaking. But as to the specifics, Terry, do you?
Yeah, I think we would simply say that if the permitting plan is developed in such a way that it provides a coordinated all the steps that happen. One of the great things that might occur in the early planning is the possibility of all departments that have relevant other permits or requirements or expertise will participate in that early stage and hopefully will be fed into these various products that come from that. If that were to be done appropriately, that probably could alleviate a large amount of our concern there.
All right, thank you very much, Madam Chair. I'm done. Yep.
And then to Mr. Sopa.
Thank you very much. One of our colleagues today used the phrase polluter pays, and I strongly object to that. The implication is that you're polluters. And in my previous life, I managed environmental licenses, and I know very well modern industry does not pollute, and it's shown in how well Canada's environmental indicators are improving. I very much appreciate Mr. Gratton's direct way of speaking, and I think he would have liked being here yesterday to hear Mr. Chris Bloomer's presentation. He's from the Pipeline Association, where he actually used the phrase that Canada has a toxic regulatory environment. And we know what the word toxic means. It means poisonous. And I think I'm astonished, Mr. Gratton, when you make the point that commodity prices are increasing around the world, but investment in Canadian mining is going down. Where in the world is mining investment going right now?
Yeah, thank you for the question. So, just a few facts for your information. What mineral exploration in Canada's percentage of mineral exploration spending has been falling for the last half dozen years, and Australia has taken up a good chunk of that. It's also going to Latin America. As we speak, last year Australia had record levels of gold production, record levels of exports. They've got 3 new lithium mines that have come on stream. They've got a nickel sulfate plant that's about to go forward. They've got a major copper mine that's about to, I think, that has started production. This at the very early stages of the rebound in commodity prices. And you look at Canada and you don't see that. It's not coming here.
Thank you. Does Australia have a different environmental project review process than Canada does?
Though a federal system, most projects are not subject to 2 levels of federal EA in Australia.
And so their review process is efficient and timely? Can you say that? I mean, reasonably? I'm loath to be overly simplistic because the systems are different, but generally speaking, it's faster. Okay. Has Australia's environment suffered because of this faster process?
We don't want to go there.
I can't. Honestly, I don't know. I don't know enough about Australia to say so. Except it's a fully developed democratic country. It is our natural competitor, and they are currently doing better than we are at attracting new investment.
Yeah, I think the question was a bit rhetorical because every modern industrial society has the highest environmental standards. I mean, it's a process that every country goes through as they get richer. The environments get better and better. So there's no doubt about it that Canada is losing out in terms of investment. Mr. Mooney, I have a specific question for you regarding Cameco and Indigenous employment. Do you have any metrics on Indigenous employment within Cameco? How many Indigenous people are employed by Cameco and from how many communities?
I do. Thank you for the question. In that regard, we maintain approximately 50% of our long-term contractors and employees are residents of Saskatchewan's north. So in that conversation, that is a long and challenging effort to get to that level of employment, but we do look for opportunities to improve those numbers and work with our northern stakeholders as we outlined in relation to training and education opportunities to further those numbers as best we can.
Have there been any studies done on the socioeconomic metrics in communities where there is a fairly high level of employment in the mining industry or the uranium industry? I know that's a little bit outside your wheelhouse, but you know, the conditions in those communities are very important, and one does expect when the employment levels are high because of mining that the social conditions will have improved.
Well, you could look at the sort of the results of diamond mining activity in the Northwest Territories and look at the acceleration of post-secondary education levels among Indigenous people in the North. And it's completely tied to the development, tied to the opening of that first mine, and ever since. There is a transformation, frankly, taking place in the NWT right now, and we are the economic sector of that territory, and it's directly attributed to our contribution. You could look at Voisey's Bay in Labrador. Today, 60% of employment at the mine is Indigenous. 90% of procurement is with Indigenous-owned businesses.
Yeah, and you know what I would say, shame on those who want to stop these projects. My last comment I'd like to make, I'd like to quote from the legal opinion on this act from Osler, Hoskin and Harcourt. Despite the Government of Canada's suggestion that the new legislation will improve the efficiency and timing of federal regulatory reviews, there is nothing in the new legislation that will necessarily achieve these results, and many aspects of the legislation will likely have the opposite effect. In conclusion, it is our view that the proposed legislation suffers from the same problems that we have been observing in project regulatory process for some time. These reviews are coming forums where all manner of social and environmental issues are expected to be addressed, even when they are beyond the ability of any single project proponent to mitigate.
Mr. Sopak, you're out of time. I just wondered if there was a question in there somewhere, but okay.
I can make a statement.
You did, yes.
I can.
Mr.
Parliamentary.
Oh, well, okay. You giving your spot to Ms. May? Please. Ms. May, you're up.
No, just a very quick spot at the. I can go for 45 seconds, and then it can go back to you, Will? Is that
My
okay?
understanding, Ms. May, is that we're able to make it so that I go at the end for my full period and you get a full.
So what I'm going to do is I'm going to just add a little bit more time. So you've got 6 minutes. Go right ahead.
Wow. Thank you. All right. Well, my question then is I wanted to address my question to the Mining Association of Canada, because earlier you used the term disproportionate around what had happened to the mining industry under SIA 2012. And given that I'll say right out loud so everyone knows, I've been a colleague of Monsieur Gratton and Madame Laura Lean for quite some time, because we've been on multi-stakeholder panels when I was at Sierra Club of Canada. So we've worked on EA for a while. I don't know how many years have you worked on the EA process in your role as a representative of the mining industry?
26 years.
26 years, okay, because your mic wasn't on when you said 26 years. Okay, so you have a lot of experience. What I wanted to ask is, given your experience on behalf of the mining industry, interacting with several different iterations of environmental assessment law in Canada, you've experienced the environmental assessment process up to 2012 under the previous SIA. You've experienced SIA 2012, and I know you haven't experienced C69 because it isn't in place yet. But of what you've experienced, Mr. Gratton, which would you say was the form of EA that was most, was fairest and easiest to work with from the point of view of MAC?
Well, I'll spare the committee breaking into song and singing shares if I could turn back time. But it's this sort of collective view within our membership that the best years of environmental assessment were from 2010 to 2012. If the previous government had stopped in 2010, that was when the regime was the most predictable, most certain collaboration with the provinces was best. and the projects that went through in that window, which wasn't very long, you know, that was the heyday of environmental assessment for our sector.
So in following up on that, one of the things that was novel, and I think for a lot of people who are looking at C69, their only experience was with CIA 2012. Some people are relatively, not to say they don't have background and experience, but they're newer to the process than some of us who've been through this a few times. But prior to CIA 2012, there wouldn't have been the problem for your industry of the National Energy Board having a role, the Canadian Nuclear Safety Commission having a role, the offshore boards having a role. It was exclusively that you worked with one agency. I don't want to answer the question for you, but what's your experience with the energy regulators' introduction to the process?
Can I answer it?
Sure, go ahead.
So it wasn't so much the introduction or non-introduction of the NEB and CNSC, because they don't affect any of our members' projects other than CNSC for uranium. It was more the introduction of the agency. So prior to 2010, you had the diffuse self-assessment by 40, I think it was federal authorities. They naturally dragged their heels, so they just never started the assessment. Whereas the agency whose job it was to do assessments started the assessments, and to us that was just like the best thing ever that they actually started. 2012, initially, it sounded like it might be an improvement, and we didn't initially see the disproportionate number. I mean, in the first couple of years of CIA, we were 80% of the projects, and we were going like, we're not 80% of anything.
Clarify, when you say the first years of CIA, you mean CIA
2012. Yeah, sorry, CIA 2012. So that was a shock, but then some of the other provisions, it wasn't evident, and what was envisaged at the time of the passing of 2012 isn't the way it was implemented. So some of the problems didn't really become evident until 2015, 2016.
And the obvious one being cumulative effects, and I'll just give you an example, but there was a project, a mining project in Northeast BC that reached a conclusion of significant adverse cumulative effects. As a result of that, a decision of Cabinet was required, and there was an 18-month delay before Cabinet actually ruled and justified the project, so it could proceed. And the issue had to do with the projects, which is an underground coal mine with a very small footprint, but its contribution to cumulative effects on caribou and the traditional rights of Indigenous peoples to hunt the caribou. While this was going on, the NEB approved an energy pipeline whose impact on the same habitat was 3 times the size of this mine. So you had a very different conclusion from 2 separate federal agencies. No one, and I'm sure the previous government would never have anticipated that would be the outcome of CIA 2012, but that's, we did not foresee the effects of cumulative effects, and being one of the only ones left standing under CIA 2012, that would be the outcome. But that is what has happened, and this is what, among the changes in this proposed legislation, we hope it will aim to fix that particular issue.
Thank you. I really appreciate the time from my Liberal colleagues. Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted one interjection there.
Very quick, yeah.
Yes, and I think that we would largely agree with some of the sentiments expressed, but we do have the view within the Canadian Nuclear Association that having a single authority lead both the assessment and the licensing, that the introduction in 2012 of that was a positive change for our industry, because it brought about brought to a head some of the questions that Mr. Gratton was talking about lead and moving matters forward.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So what we normally do at this point is Ms. Duncan has 3 minutes. I'm quite prepared to add 3 minutes to yours, giving you 6. You guys would get 6 and 6, and then we're done. Okay? That's adding on an extra short round. Okay? Ms. Duncan?
Thank you. We'll just see how it goes. I may not need it all. I just wanted to thank Mr. Gratton for his intervention, saying that there should also be support for the public, Indigenous, and so forth, financial support to participate in the regulatory process. We talked about it for the EIA process, but we never talk about the parallel. And I would encourage him to write a letter of support for the Canadian Environmental Network, who are seeking restoration of the fund that Mr. Baird cut. It was started in 1979. It was very helpful because then you had constructive input to industry. So I would encourage you to speak to the Canadian Environmental Network, but thank you for your intervention on that. I think it was the Canadian Electricity Association that raised this issue. They were concerned that there's not enough emphasis in this review on the economic benefits. But surely it's equally important that we also identify the economic costs. For example, some development could impact other sectors like the fishery, or they could impact the traditional harvest, or tourism, or could cause health impacts through air pollution or contamination of water. Back in the 1980s, my recollection was we did a lot of work before review panels on not just environmental impact assessment and economic, but also social impact. And for some reason, by the time we got to the mid-1990s, that disappeared. So would you not agree that there probably is a lot of expertise out there that we could just bring back? This isn't something new and different, that for looking at sustainability of a project, that we look at a more broad-based. And is it not also true that the federal government has an international obligation to deliver on the 2030 Sustainable Development Goals, and this is the mechanism to do that?
You go ahead, Frank.
Well, yeah, I was just to preface it, and Chair, you can talk about some of the specifics. But this is when you're talking specifically about electricity and about the emphasis on costs and the emphasis on impacts. I would just step back and point out. It was noted earlier that Canada's greenhouse gas emissions targets. We seem to be stalled, but that's not the case with respect to electricity. With respect to the electricity sector, over the last 20 years...
That's not what I'm
that is
getting
within
to.
the context.
The specific concern was raised that they thought that C-69 does not have enough emphasis on the economic advantages or benefits. And so what I'm asking is, should we not be doing a balance? My recollection is that every hearing I've been at, we hear lots about the economic benefits, the local county comes in, local towns and so forth, but should we not also be hearing about the other side, possible economic costs?
The actual written text of our initial presentation, that section was entitled Balance. So balance is what we're hoping to see. We expect that with the wording in the bill and the documents that are prepared around the edges of that, the regulations and so on, that there will be the reemergence of additional consideration for Indigenous, health, socioeconomic. I think that we're concerned that there's not also a bit more information and an emphasis on the fact that there are economic benefits in many cases to some of our projects. So I think we expect to see all of those things, and we're simply pointing out that I think it's only mentioned twice in the bill, and we think that others are mentioned in more places.
Maybe I could turn to Mr. Gratton again, because he provided that information about where they have been, employing Indigenous peoples in their project and so forth. Surely it's the job of proponents, in parallel to the review of these projects, to be pursuing economic benefits for the community. Surely that's not just the responsibility of the review agency. It's my impression that the more that the proponent does work up front in working with environmentalists, the local community, Indigenous, the better chance of getting your project approved and with less objections.
Yes, I can stop there. But impact benefit. You'd be hard pressed to find a mining project over the last 10 years that was approved that didn't come with agreements with local Indigenous communities, and those. And you're right in that. I mean, for our projects today to be successful, for a multiplicity of reasons, not just sort of social license issues or so on, but we want to ensure that the Indigenous peoples near our project have full access to job opportunities and procurement opportunities that our projects will provide. And that can't happen automatically. Often there is education and training needs. Often there may be needs for support to help them develop new businesses so that they can actually take advantage of the opportunities that we provide. I'd say that our industry has been doing remarkable work over the last 20 years, and I think we keep getting better at it, ensuring that those benefits do occur. But I agree with you, if we did nothing, they wouldn't. But I would also make the point, too, that it's not just our job. Education and training, I mean, we do, through impact benefit agreements, provide a lot of support in that area, but we also often look to provincial and federal governments to supplement that, because that also is government's role.
Sorry, and I just want...
2 seconds.
2
Go
seconds?
ahead.
All right. I just wanted to add in that regard that really the comments earlier was the focus seems to be unnecessarily on the adverse effects, and similar to what the CEA had to say in that regard, what we're advocating is that the focus isn't solely on the adverse effects, but also the positive socioeconomic benefits of the projects in question.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Fast.
Well, Madam Chair, I certainly support Mr. Mooney's last comment. There has to be a balance. We have to look at the benefits on the environmental side as well as on the economic side. Mr. Graton, in your testimony, you briefly touched on what the industry is doing to address its carbon footprint, but I'd like to dig a little deeper into that. Your industry has taken huge steps forward in making your industry cleaner, more efficient. There are a number of different tools that government uses to incent Canadians and Canadian industries to move towards a more sustainable future. They can use technology, they can use carbon taxes, they can use infrastructure investments, they can use regulations, caps on emissions. I'd love to hear from you just a very brief description of where the industry is going to respond to some of these environmental challenges, more specifically to addressing greenhouse gas emissions, and perhaps of the tools that government has available, which one has been most effective in helping your industry reform itself into one that really is responsive to the public's environmental concerns?
That's a complex question, but if you look at our industry trajectory, we're increasingly investing in northern Canada, which is often off-grid, which makes it more expensive because we often have to also build the infrastructure necessary to support those investments. But also it often means we're having to rely on diesel generation, which is a greenhouse gas fuel. And being able to tap into the grid would change that, our carbon footprint significantly. So, looking forward in terms of the future mining industry in this country, probably the single most important thing that could be done is to invest in new infrastructure, new electric generating infrastructure in Canada's north. And it's not just something that would benefit our sector. Communities themselves are diesel dependent, Indigenous communities across the north, and it's not the most reliable form of electricity. There are environmental issues associated with it. They can break down. I think every member of this committee, I'm sure, is aware of these issues. So I think investing in infrastructure, particularly in Canada's north, would make the most significant contribution to our ability to continue to generate a contribution to Canada and to our northern Indigenous communities, and also at the same time make a real contribution to reducing Canada's greenhouse gases.
I cede my time to Mr. Sopa.
Thank you.
Sorry,
Mr. Graton, regarding the investment that Canada is not getting because of our quote-unquote toxic regulatory environment, can you estimate how much money how much investment is not coming to Canada because of our toxic regulatory environment, among other things? And I'll just preface that by also saying there's an article here, pipeline shortage to cost the economy $15.6 billion this year. So the oil industry has done the math, and I'm just wondering if the mining industry has done similar math.
We have seen investment projections. Now, you have to put this in a certain amount of context. We are coming out of a down cycle. So some of it is explained by the fact that we are coming out of a down cycle and certain plans were shelved. But we are looking at about a 60% reduction in proposed projects. And we have seen we've seen exploration expenditures halved over the last 6 years. And in saying that, you know, I know that there's a tendency for this chamber to point fingers, but it started 6 years ago. It just hasn't stopped. So, you know, my plea to all of you is, my concern is the sort of politicization of natural resources in this country, something that I think Canada is known around the world for being the best in, is harming our future. And I would implore all of you to think about where this is taking us as a country and the kind of risk that we're putting Canada in by politicizing our natural resource industries. We are really good at this. We have improved considerably. Just last week, Environment Canada released a report on air quality that shows how much better our air is, and it was in large part because of how our industry and the chemicals industry has improved their emissions controls. That's the direction. We need to stand up for these sectors a bit more in this country.
Well, I defy anybody to find an instance where the Conservative Party said negative things about Canada's natural resource industries, and I'll leave the other parties to make their own statements there. If I have a bit of time.
Seconds.
Sure.
All right.
I'm good.
Okay, you're good. Thank you. And the last questioner is Mr. Aldag. Mr. Amos, sir.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Member Sopuck, for that breathless partisanship. No, I mean, I'm flabbergasted by the politicized contributions. I mean, if Canada has a toxic regulatory environment, we're emerging from 10 years of Conservative governance. You know, you speak to polluter pays. I mean, clearly the polluter pays principle applies in a political context as well, and thank goodness we have a new government. I'd like to invite our witness from the Mining Association of Canada, and thank you to all of you. This has been actually really helpful. I'd like to invite Mr. Gratton, though, to speak to the mining sector's experience of a loss of public trust. How has the past decade or so changed in terms of the public trust component of average Canadians, many of whom don't really experience the mining sector, don't understand it, don't know it? How has their trust in regulatory institutions been affected?
Thank you for that question. The mining sector invented the term social license, and a lot of people are angry at us for that. But we recognized some 20 years ago that our future required us to make sure that we had community support. And as a result, we put in place a program called Towards Sustainable Mining that is now being exported and adopted by other countries around the world. It has as its fundamental goal making sure that the industry works closely with communities, engages them openly and transparently. And I think that as a result of that, the polarization around mining projects in Canada has largely diminished. And so if you look at, you know, project reviews around mining projects over the past, 15 years, you could count on one hand the number that have been controversial or that have generated, public opposition. And I would add that those examples were rejected, which would speak to, at least at one level, I may not have agreed with those decisions, but they would speak to, I think, an example of how the regulatory system for mining actually works. And I think how we feel as a sector in part is the politicization of of natural resources, particularly the spillover effects of the controversies around pipelines, has had an effect on the rest of us. And I think that if people are asking questions about Canada's investment, a place to invest, they're not looking at the fact that actually most mining projects have gone through the process and come out the other side and been approved and come with Indigenous agreements, etc. They just see a cloud hanging over Canada. And that's why I'm urging all of you to think about the harm that this is doing to this country, and that we need to depoliticize, all of you, how we are dealing with our natural resources sectors, because it's harming everyone.
Thank you. That's helpful. And in that vein of depoliticizing, I will go strictly to substance on an interesting issue raised by the Electricity Association around a privative clause. As far as I'm aware, your association is the only one to have advanced this proposal formally, and as someone who's operated in the legal field for some time on natural resources and environmental issues, I'm curious about it. I'm curious about the suggestion, both from an industry side and from a public interest community side, because it would seem to me that an opening of a privative clause which would restrict the involvement of the judiciary in an oversight role over the executive decision making pursuant to an impact assessment process, it would potentially not only limit a given community or special interest groups' ability to bring into question the quality of the decision or the actual following of particular steps that are legally required. But on the other hand, it could also impact industry to the extent that they didn't, that a company or an industry association that felt like a particular project didn't get a fair shake, potentially because it was heavily politicized. That such a process would then not be as effectively
Got
challengeable.
1 minute, Will.
So I would invite you to comment on that, because I'm not certain that I would agree with a privative clause idea.
Well, I think we would have introduced the notion not as an exclusive item, so not a lawyer, but I think what we would say is that a lot of controversial issues that are being raised. This is going to create a much more open process where a lot of that is going to get discussed. At some point, elected officials, the minister or the governor and council, at the end of that process is going to make a determination. And I think all we're saying is that process is going to be fulsome and lengthy, and when we get to the end of it, there should be very rare occasions where that needs to be questioned. From an industry point of view, we don't often take that kind of a decision to court. We have the ability to decide we're not going to build the project. And so I think it's a notion as opposed to an absolute.
To end it there, I want to thank our guests very much for good discussion, lots of good information for us to consider. I know I saw fingers going up where you wanted to chime in on one of the questions, but you didn't have the opportunity because our time's limited. We welcome any further comments and suggestions you have. If you have answers to those questions you didn't get to tell us and you want to, please send it. We are open to receive until April the 6th, so please send us whatever you have. Then we will be able to consider that in time to start bringing forward recommended changes. So thanks again. I'm going to suspend to clear the room. We're going to go into close. Thank you.